Hi there, this is Joe. It's nice to be talking to you virtually. And I'm not much of a lecture guy, and I'm not much of a PowerPoint guy, but there are a couple of times during the quarter that I want to get information out to you so that you have some of the tools that you'll need to talk about the literature that we're reading. And so this one's about poetry. And I want us to see if we can unpack a few of the key terms that I'll want you to use when we talk about the poems that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks. So, first off, what makes poetry poetry? That's a deceptively simple question. Um, but if you think about it a little bit, if you scratch the surface, you realize that it's not so easy to tell poetry from prose. How is a how is a prose poem, for example, different from a short story? Or how is a lyric poem different from a work of flash fiction? Um, that's actually not such a simple question. Well, like all art, poetry has meaning. In fact, all communication has meaning, right? But art, something that characterizes all art, whether it's poetry or film or dance or sculpture, the art carries some sort of meaning. There's something that the artist is trying to communicate to the viewer or the reader. And so poetry, just like fiction, just like drama, has meaning in it. But what characterizes poetry is that this meaning is conveyed through the actual sound of the words. It's not just um, it's not just the meaning of the words that carries the meaning, not just the definition of the words that carries the meaning, forgive me, but also how the words sound, how the rhythm of the words together sound, how the lines and sentences are arranged into a form. All of those things convey meaning in a way that prose does not. Now, a good story will often use repetition, but poetry really relies on repetition more than fiction or drama does. Um, so if I put this up on the screen, this is a poem by Robert Herrick. It's about 350 years old. And that's the whole poem, just those 4 lines. And you can immediately recognize it as a poem. Here, I'll read it for you. Here a pretty baby lies, sung asleep with lullabies. Pray be silent and not stir the easy earth that covers her. A beautiful, sad little poem. And first off, you can hear that there's rhyme in it, obviously, and that there's a rhythm to it, and that rhyme and rhythm conveys meaning in a way that prose does not, in a way that fiction or usually drama do not. So, what are the terms I'm going to want you to use in talking about poetry? Well, there are a lot of terms that you could use. I mean, this is just an introduction to literature class. It's not even an introduction to poetry class. We just get 2 weeks on poetry. So there's a lot that we could talk about that we're just not going to have time to talk about in this very brief introduction to poetry. But there are some basic terms that I do think all of us could use to talk about the poems that we encounter. And as you use them more, I think you're going to get more familiar with them and more familiar with how poetry uses these concepts to convey meaning. So the first of these is meter, rhyme, image, which you will find in fiction and drama as well, but which has a special role in poetry, form, and tone. Tone also appears in fiction and in drama, but which has a special role in poetry. So these are all terms that I'm going to want you to take up as you describe these poems, as you ask questions about these poems, as you write about these poems later on. Let's start with meter, shall we? So meter very simply is just the number of syllables in each line of poems, in each line of poetry. Um, However, it's not just the number of syllables, it's also the way those syllables carry emphasis. And I'll give you a couple examples. Iambic is a kind of rhythm that is very, very common in English poetry. Iambic rhythm puts syllables together in pairs. You have pairs of syllables, and in each pair, the second syllable has the emphasis. Whose woods these are, I do not know. Whose woods these are, I do not know. There's a kind of rhythm to that line, and if you break it down, you can hear that the second syllable in each pair has the emphasis. Whose woods these are, I do not know. Sounds a little bit like a heartbeat. That's certainly not the only kind of meter available to us. Another common one is dactylic. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. You can probably hear that dactylic feet are broken into threes. The syllables come in triplets. And in those triplets of syllables, it's the first syllable that gets the emphasis. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. That's, oh gosh, I think it's a Longfellow poem. I think that's Evangeline. Trochaic, that's a rhythm that where the syllables come in pairs, but where it's the first syllable that has the emphasis. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble. Those are the famous lines from the play Macbeth. And you can hear, if you compare that trochaic line with the iambic line up there at the top, both of those have syllables that come in pairs, but you can hear that the emphasis is different. In trochaic, it's the first syllable, double, double, toil and trouble. And in the iambic, it's the second syllable. Whose woods these are, I do not know. Well, different languages use different meters more commonly than others. For instance, dactylic that's the most common kind of meter for classical Latin poetry, just because the Latin language is built in such a way that dactylic lines work really well. Dactylic is not at all common in English. In fact, in English, our most common by far is iambic pentameter. And that second word, pentameter, just means that there are 5 pairs of syllables in each line. Remember that in iambic meter, syllables come in pairs, and it's the second syllable that gets the emphasis. Pentameter just means that there are 5 pairs. So why don't we just take a look at a poem and kind of unpack the meter in there. This is a very famous sonnet by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And I'll read it to you, and you just listen to how the emphasis passes through each line. Where does the emphasis come? And I think you'll hear that there's a great deal of iambic pentameter in there. Now, most great poets like Edna St. Vincent Millay, they're not slaves to a specific meter. This poem's in iambic pentameter, but that doesn't mean that every single word is iambic. She bends a little bit, she modifies a little bit in order to convey certain kinds of effects, in order to convey a certain flow. But you're going to hear overall that this poem clearly has an iambic pentameter feel to it. 10 syllables in each line, and those 10 syllables are broken into 5 pairs, and in each pair, the second syllable gets the greater emphasis. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know what summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. Sad little poem. And you can probably hear, we'll return to this poem a couple times in the lecture, you can probably hear there were places where it wasn't iambic, but a great deal of this poem was clearly in that ba-bum, 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 ba-bum rhythm. To take maybe a finer look at it, let's just look at a couple of lines from that poem, just 3 lines here. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again, I have to pronounce it that way to get the rhyme. That's how she would have said it 100 years ago. Will turn to me at midnight with a cry. You can hear iambic. That ba-bum, 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 bum-bum, bum-bum. Sounds like a heartbeat. That's a good indicator that if you hear that kind of heartbeat in the line, that you're listening to iambic poetry. And if there are 5 of those beats in each line, bum-bum, 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 then you've got iambic pentameter, which is the most common kind of meter that we have in English poetry. All right, let's move on a little bit, shall we? So, rhyme. And this is probably obvious to you. You knew this way before you ever came into this class, that there's lots of poetry that does not rhyme, especially in English. English is actually not a super well-suited language for rhyming, just because of the way English is. You know, there are lots of words that don't actually have that many rhymes. You know, life, knife, wife, strife, jife. I made up that last one. I mean, there just aren't that many rhymes for life. And so English was a language that fairly early on in its literary tradition, looked at alternative ways of putting poetry together. A lot of our poetry doesn't rhyme. Having said that, a lot of poetry in English does rhyme. Just because it's hard to rhyme in English doesn't mean it's impossible. And there's a lot of fantastic poetry that rhymes. Now, rhyme is a little more complicated than we might have learned back in first grade when you were first thinking about rhyme in school. There are lots of different ways to make a rhyme. For this class, we're going to characterize rhyme in basically 2 ways. You have full rhyme. That's the kind of rhyme you learned about in first grade. Life, strife, wife, knife, jife, my new word. And then half rhyme. And half rhymes are words that don't rhyme exactly, but where it's clear the words sound awfully close, where it's nearly a rhyme. And that's actually a much more common type of rhyme in English poetry today. It's sort of the rhyming tradition of the last, 50 to 100 years has really moved more and more towards half rhyme, which is sometimes called slant rhyme. Here's an example. This is just a few lines from Seamus Heaney's poem, A Kite for Eibhean. And Seamus Heaney was a great Irish poet, won the Nobel Prize, about 25 years ago. Let's just read just this first 6 lines. Air from another life and time and place, pale blue heavenly air is supporting a white wing beating high against the breeze. Place and breeze. Those don't rhyme. And yet, they're not just 2 randomly picked words. Either place and breeze do sound awfully close to one another in a lot of ways. They're nearly a rhyme. That's a half rhyme. And yes, it is a kite, as when one afternoon all of us there trooped out among the briar hedges and stripped thorn. There again, afternoon and thorn. A lot of people, myself included, feel that half rhyme is a little more subtle than a full rhyme. It kind of draws the reader in and forces her to really pay closer attention to the sound of the poems, to the sound of the end of the line, because it doesn't just jump out at you the way a full rhyme does. Life, wife, strife, knife. It's something where you see a connection there, but it's a little more hidden. I really like it. Let's move on. Talk about images. And there's not a huge amount to say about this, but one of the main points I want to make when we talk about poetry is, when you use the term image in everyday language, most of us think about visual images, the TV images or movie images. But image in poetry refers to more than just visual image. It refers to really any sensory effect. That is a visual image, but also an auditory image, something that, the reader hears, or a smell, or a taste, or a touch. Any sensory effect is referred to as image. And image was not always the most important driver of poetry in English. There are lots of other ways to organize a poem, but it's extremely important in the last 100 years or so in poetry. This the poetic movement called modernism, which is part of a greater artistic movement called modernism, started around 100 years ago, and the modernist poets and the people that came after, like the objectivists, image became extremely important to them. Charles Olson, who was a famous objectivist poet, has a quote about this: "One perception must immediately and directly lead to a further perception." And basically what he's arguing there is that for any poem to work, it's got to move from one image to another image. You can't have spaces in the poem where there aren't images. You have to be creating things that the reader can hear or see or taste or touch or smell. And like I said, that's not always how poetry was in English. But that's certainly been the trend over the last 100 years or so. And the last thing I want to say about image is that when you're looking at a poem that doesn't rhyme, when you're looking at a poem that doesn't have an obvious meter to it, it's often called free verse. Free verse only works if there's image in that verse, if there are images in that poem that hold the ideas of the poem together. Without image, you don't have a poem if you don't also have rhyme and meter. Lots of poems don't rhyme, lots of poems don't have a clear meter, and those are called free verse. And without rhyme and meter, you've got to have image, otherwise you don't have a poem. All right, so let's move on a little bit. And we just got a couple last terms to talk about. Form is one that, again, is very common with certain kinds of poetry. There are whole bodies of poetry written in, like I said, free verse. That doesn't really have an obvious form to it. But that doesn't mean that that most English poetry is formless. A lot of the poetry we write and read does have a form, and we won't be able to get as deeply into that as I'd like in an introduction to literature class, but we can at least scratch the surface on it. First off, a lot of the forms that we have were inherited from the Greeks, and there were two main forms that the Greeks gave us: the lyric and the epic. And you're probably familiar with both of those words. Epic poetry, the second one I'll take up first. Epic poetry is something that is not commonly written today, but you may be familiar with the epic poems of the Greeks, like the Odyssey and the Iliad, or of the Romans, the Aeneid. There are epics in English as well. Probably the most famous one is Paradise Lost, the great classic of John Milton. And it's an amazing poem. It's really a masterpiece, but it's long. It's like a 300-page long poem. And so that's a little more than we're going to take up in a class like this. And like I said, there aren't a whole lot of people writing poetic epics today in English. I guess there are people that do it as an academic exercise, but I can't think of a single really famous poetic epic that has been written in English in the last 100 years or so. Lyric, though, practically everything that we're going to read in this class, and practically everything that you would see in a literary magazine like the New Yorker or the Atlantic, would be lyric poetry. You're all familiar with the word lyric as the words to a song, but originally that word basically referred to music, or forgive me, to poetry that was intended to be recited accompanied by a lyre. And by lyre I don't mean liar liar pants on fire. I mean lyre like the Greek harp that people would sit on their knees there. Okay, so we've got lots of open forms as well in free verse, and the great original free versifier was Walt Whitman. We'll read a little of his poetry, but then there are lots of others that critique free verse, that are kind of opposed to the idea of free verse. Robert Frost, who we'll also read, famously said that writing free verse is like playing tennis with the net down, that there's no challenge to it. But if you decide that you're not going to write a poem in free verse. You want to write it in a certain form. There are lots of lyric forms available. These, 7 that I've listed are just a few. There are really dozens of them. And you can tell from the names: sonnet, rondo, villanelle, sestina, terza rima, ghazal, haiku. Those are, many of them, not English language forms. We've inherited them in America from other cultures. We obviously aren't going to have time to familiarize ourselves with every one of these forms. Even in an introduction to poetry class where you've got the whole quarter focused just on poetry, you probably wouldn't learn all of those forms. But we can at least scratch the surface and maybe identify a specific form and really drill down into it, just so that you have the idea of how form often works in poetry. And one of the most common examples of formal poetry would be the sonnet. Many of you are probably familiar with the sonnet already. Here's some of the characteristics that a sonnet has. It's 14 lines long, and those 14 lines come in 2 parts. There's the first 8 lines, which are called the octet, and then the poem kind of shifts gears and often becomes more philosophical, turns into a sort of a philosophical musing on those first 8 lines. And that second part is 6 lines long, and it's called the sestet. There's a standard rhyme scheme to it, which is to say that there are rhymes, and the rhymes are matched in certain ways. For example, a common rhyme scheme in an Italian sonnet is A, B, B, A. What that means is that the first line ends with a certain sound that rhymes with the fourth line, and the second and third lines rhyme with one another. We've looked at a sonnet already just in this lecture, that Edna St. Vincent Millay poem, and as we read it together, you'll maybe notice that there are specific rhymes at the end of each line, and if we really kind of unpack it, you'll see that there's a great deal of what's the word I want? Almost ceremony to the way this poem is put together. There's a very, very specific order of operations for this poem. So let's read it again real quickly and just listen to those end lines, those end words, and where they rhyme. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh. Those are your first 4 lines, and you hear lines 1 and 4 rhyme with one another. Lines 2 and 3 rhyme with one another. This is an Italian sonnet, or what's sometimes called a Petrarchan sonnet. You'll notice in the next 4 lines the same sounds. Upon the glass and listen for reply. There's that I sound again, right? And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain, rhymes with lane and rain, for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. So all of those 8 lines really only have 2 sounds in it: why, sigh, reply, cry, or lane, rain, pain, again. And you'll notice the only period in the whole middle of the poem is right there at the end of 8 lines, right? That's the end of the octet. Then the poem shifts gears, and you may notice that it becomes slightly more philosophical. You'll also notice that the end lines change sound. So it's not just why, sigh, cry, or lane, rain, pain. We're going to get some new sounds in here, and they will rhyme in a specific way. Thus in winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. So tree is a new sound. Let's call that C. One is a new sound. Let's call that D. And before is a new sound. Let's call that E. So C, D, E. And then you notice that gone is a half rhyme with one, right? So that's a D sound. And me rhymes with tree, so that's a C sound. And more rhymes with before, that's an E sound. So, moving on. Tone is something we'll talk about just very briefly. Tone is common to poetry and fiction and drama. In fact, all art has tone to it. And as with all art, tone can vary. You can have a heavy, kind of deep philosophical tone. You can have a light, airy tone. Um, it's probably obvious to you that not all poetry is serious, even though everything we've looked at so far is fairly serious. Um, we're going to look at a couple of poems that are, clearly more light-hearted. Having said that, even poetry that appears on the surface to be light-hearted is not necessarily as light as it appears. Here's another poem, 14 lines long, although you can probably tell from the way the stanzas look that it's not a sonnet, right? Because it's not broken into 8 lines and 6 lines. Um, and it does have a kind of rhyme scheme to it, but not the kind of formal rhyme scheme that the last sonnet we read has. It has some rhymes, but the rhyme scheme is definitely different from Edna St. Vincent Millay. This is a short poem by Billy Collins, The Golden Years, and I'll just read it quickly. And as I'm reading, you can tell it's kind of lighthearted. It's meant to be a little bit jokey, and if you peel back the skin of the joke a little bit, you notice that there's something a little darker in there too. The Golden Years. All I do these drawn-out days is sit in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge, where there are no pheasants to be seen, and last time I looked, no ridge. I could drive over to Quail Falls and spend the day there playing bridge, but the lack of a falls and the absence of quail would only remind me of Pheasant Ridge. I know a widow at Fox Run and another with a condo at Smoky Ledge. One of them smokes and neither can run, so I'll stick to the pledge I made to Midge. Who frightened the fox and bulldozed the ledge? I ask in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge. So, it's again kind of just a light-hearted look at what it means to live in a subdivision and be an old person, and yet, if you muse on those names of subdivisions and think about how many subdivisions have names like Pheasant Ridge and Quail Falls and Smoky Ledge and Fox Run, and where are the ledges? Where are the pheasants and the foxes? It's a good question. And so even though you've got you've got a kind of a lighthearted tone, you notice that underneath the tone is something a little more serious than that. Well, that's really all I want us to go over for now with poetry. You've been very patient to sit through this lecture, and like I said, I'm not going to do a lot of lectures. There's just this one and then one on fiction, but these terms are ones that I really do want us to use in the discussion forums and in your writing as you try to unpack what the poems mean. Meter, rhyme, image, form, and tone. And I'm happy to unpack any of those terms at greater length for any of you. If you've got a question, feel free to email me or just to put it up in the forums. And of course, there's plenty of other material that you could consult to get a better feel for what these terms mean. To be honest, the Wikipedia page is on all of those terms. Those are pretty good pages, so you could get a lot just from Wikipedia there. So for now, let's just have fun with this poetry. We're going to read about 10 poems over the next couple of weeks, and you'll write about a lot of them, and then we'll move on to fiction. So thanks a lot, and you'll hear from me again in a couple of weeks. Take care.